How do we look? Is the camera good? Do you get both of them in? All right. Hi there, folks on the internet. Today we're doing our Joesph Campbell study group, and we should have read chapter 1. But instead, Melissa is away on vacation with her family, and instead you get me, and instead of reading, I found 2 witches who like Joesph Campbell. And they're pretty famous witches, too. We've got Therese Pendragon, who is the legend of Salem, and then we also have Reverend Don Lewis, head of the Correllian tradition. And they think that Joesph Campbell is pretty awesome. And so we're just going to talk about how awesome he is tonight. So why do you guys like Joesph Campbell?
Well, there are a couple of things that I would say. One of them is that Campbell really introduced a lot of people to elevated spiritual concepts, particularly in the late 70s and earlier. But as I recall, it was in the late 70s he was all over PBS. And I think that really did a lot for people's understanding of some of these concepts. And he also is extremely syncretic, and he looks for the similarities in different points of view. And his attitude, as I read him, is that spiritual truths are pretty much universal, and that although different cultures and different religions will have their own take on it, you're going to find the same themes because they are a part of the human condition, a part of the universal condition. And I think that of all the different things he talks about, that in itself is probably the most elevated concept.
So I know that a lot of the concepts that you just talk about are something that's in Correllian witchcraft.
Yes.
Now, is that...
So of course that's why I like it.
Now, is that because that's something that your family's been teaching for generations, or...
Yes.
Okay, so your family's been doing this kind of stuff, and Joesph Campbell helped kind of bring the information to help support that to a general audience, would you say?
Well, effectively. I mean, it's a similar point of view.
Yeah.
And I think that what Campbell does, Campbell examines aspects of spirituality that we did not particularly examine, and in different ways, but from a similar mindset and a similar point of view. And I think that sharing that with people at such a wide level is probably the most significant aspect of it, the fact that it was not kept in a narrow confine. So I see its importance largely from a social role as well as what he actually wrote about. I was talking with, I think I was talking with Lexi earlier about Eden Gray, who wrote the very important tarot books of the 60s that really helped a lot with the spread of the popularity of tarot outside of narrow circles. And I think that in a lot of ways, Joesph Campbell is for advanced spiritual thinking what Eden Gray is for the tarot. The person who really made it popular for people who were not necessarily following it as their main life path and might not otherwise have learned about it, but had the opportunity to do so.
All right, and Therese, I know that while Dawn has read a lot about Joesph Campbell, you're new to it like a lot of us.
Right.
But you're bringing to it a different perspective than many of us. You've got a lot more experience behind you, so you're bringing with it your experience to be viewing some really interesting concepts.
Yeah, I think his concepts are very interesting, as he certainly, as the Reverend points out, and I've been exposed to a lot of the PBS programs, certainly during the 70s, which really I thought was amazing, because a lot of the things that he talked about I felt very deeply to begin with. And I went, yes, at last, someone that understands how I feel. And I'm sure how many other people feel as well.
I think that's exactly the thing. For the people for whom spirituality was their life, it was wonderful to see someone on PBS talking about it to everybody. Yeah. And for the people who would otherwise not have known, who might not have had access to teachers who would be able to teach at that level, I think it was a wonderful thing.
Yeah, indeed it was. It was great. Like you were saying, it exposed a lot of people into a different form of thinking. That they learned to look inside themselves to understand what humanity is really all about. Are we spiritual beings or not?
Mm-hmm.
So are we just animal? Are we something beyond that? It really helped to lift a lot of the consciousness, of people, and have them really question life.
And I think the fact that he examined these different subjects that he spoke about from the point of view of all different cultures at once was an extremely insightful way to present it. Certainly not original to him. He's certainly not the only one who did that, but he did it in a particularly persuasive way, a particularly accessible way that I think was very important.
And he was also greatly influenced by a lot of the, certainly the famous psychologists of his day, Nietzsche, Carl Jung, Freud, that helped change his perspective about the human mind and the psychology of religion, particularly mythology.
Yes. And I think that that point of view that he represents is one that many people have moved away from to their detriment, because it really was a very enlightened way of looking at things. And it seems like today people are looking more often at what separates them than what unites them. And what Campbell's all about is the idea that these themes unite the whole human race, and they do. You look in every culture and it's there. And this idea that we were all separate little piles of carrots and peas and corn is not how people are, and it's not how culture ever was.
No.
And it's a very mistaken idea that has its origins not in the reality of what was, but in the study of what was, which has led to an artificial idea of separation that did not actually exist. Now, that's not to say that they all knew each other and shared ideas, but many of them did, and even when they didn't, they had the same ideas. They were very universal. And that universality, to me, it is really the thing that when one is a spiritual person, one needs to be looking at.
That's very correct. Very correct. It has, he's definitely serving his purpose, certainly with the new study of him all over again, particularly with the youth. The youth are going, wait a minute, what's this about? It's really wonderful that a lot of the youth today are beginning to understand a bit more about what the ancient people already knew.
Back to you, Madam Moderator.
I noticed that you mentioned a little bit about various psychologists. Now, is that something that you've read about yourself?
I have. I've read many books on Jung and many books, Freud, and certainly their ideas. And when I read some of Joesph Campbell's work, and I realized that there definitely had to be an influence of these people, and found out later that there certainly was. And it is very interesting, the workings of the human mind, the conscious, the subconscious, the superconsciousness, all these things, and how we use, how we're ritualistic in our daily lives, and how we use myth inadvertently without even realizing it, just from our day-to-day living, and the habits that we form, and the beliefs, little things.
Well, we were talking earlier, and one of the things that I find most interesting in Campbell's work is discussion of the origins of the modern idea of individuality. Mm-hmm. And one of the points that he makes, and he's not the only one who's examined this idea, and I believe it's a true idea, is that the idea of individuality as we have it now is fairly modern. And that if you go back, particularly before the birth of writing, people's ideas of themselves really had more to do with their role in society and less with the idea that they were an individual. And he talks at this at some length in some of his works. And I think he's probably pretty correct about it, that our idea of how we are as individuals has grown and developed as we have grown and developed as a culture, and I think it will be doing more so in the next 20 to 30 years, because our concepts of individuality, I think, will be substantially changed by the changes in our technology. Just as they were developed in the first place, or developed further, because I'm sure we always had some aspect of individuality, but the point that Campbell makes is that the development of writing really caused people to first really differentiate themselves just from their role. And that before writing, you would measure yourself as what your role in life was: a husband, a wife, a father, a mother, a son, a daughter, a householder, a warrior, a priest, or whatever. And you did not think of how you made that role your own, because you didn't make it your own. You lived up to the cultural expectation of it. And your success or failure depended on how close you came to that role. And you still see that in some of the religions that have their origin in that time period and have never necessarily developed away from that idea. And they have this very little cookie-cutter idea of what a person must be, and they still fit themselves to that cookie-cutter. Whereas most of us think in terms of developing the role that we play in light of our own talents and individuality. And as I say, Campbell traces this to the development of writing. I would add to that the development of artwork had a lot to do with it as well. Because when people started making memorials and testimonials to individuals and their lives, they began to think of themselves as individuals. Whereas before this, you really had not had that so much. And one of the things that Campbell points out is that the whole the ancient practice of tomb sacrifice, where people would either kill themselves or be killed to accompany their husband, their wife, their king, or whomever into the afterlife, basically ceased at the dawn of writing. And he says that this has everything to do with that development of a sense of individuality, which caused people to be less willing to cross the veil so easily. And I think that there's probably a certain amount of truth in that. I'm sure there's more to be thought about with it, but I think that is quite true. And if you look in Egypt, where certainly one of the places writing was first developed, and one of the places where the cult of the individual was certainly first developed, much more so than in Mesopotamia, where writing also came early. But in Egypt, you see people as individuals much more early. And they were probably, I believe, categorically the first people to cease the practice of human sacrifice. And that, I think, definitely has to do with the development of writing and artwork and individuality and a new way of looking at things. And I think that people are not sufficiently mindful of just how elastic the idea of individuality really has been historically. And there are certain peoples who arrived at a modern understanding of individuality much earlier, others who came to it much later, and some have not come to it now. Which I think is perfectly natural, because everything takes its time to spread around the world. What is not perfectly natural, in my opinion, are people trying to regress to an earlier understanding. Although perhaps they never really achieved the modern understanding, I don't know.
Well, you said with the advent of technology, this idea of the self is still yet changing. How do you think that technology is going to affect how we perceive ourselves moving forward?
I think, well, you know, I think that you can't really speak to a new understanding before you have it.
Yeah.
But I think that our idea of who and what we are will expand.
Okay.
And particularly as computer technology develops, our ability to share experiences already is expanding exponentially. And I think that in some ways, the barriers between people, and not only the barriers between people in the physical world, also our perceived barriers to past lives and to other spirits, I think a lot of them are going to shift. And I think that our concept of individuality, meaning who we are, is going to be encompassing a lot more than it has done. But how exactly that will come to pass is going to have to kind of wait and see how it does.
Yeah.
Because one can only kind of speculate. And it's very hard to speculate what different technology will mean until you've experienced it.
Interesting. Yes.
I think in some ways we already are seeing this.
Yeah.
In other ways, I think it's yet to come. And some of the things that we can see where technology is going. And we can see that our ability to communicate through technology will be very similar to what we currently do through clairvoyance. It is just obviously going there. Our ability to deal with the various virtual worlds is going to change how we look at things. It already really has. And one of the things that you see in the last 30 years from certain conservative religious groups is a deep reaction against the game Dungeons and Dragons and everything connected to it. And the reason is because it has a different view of individuality. When people take part in role-playing games, they basically say to themselves, well, what if I were someone else? What if I were in another time and place? And they have to look at those other things. And for those conservative religious movements, they don't want you to be able to think that you could be anyone else. They want you nailed right in place. Whereas that ability to expand your consciousness to say, well, I can see what it would be like to be another person. I can see what it would be like to be in another culture. Is problematic to those who don't want to be able to see that other side. Or even to know that there is another side.
Isn't that kind of essential to understanding history, for example?
You would think so. But look at people. How many people do understand history, particularly in that particular movement? How many people complain about how boring history is? Which it isn't if you actually approach it from the right angle. But people rarely do. But if you can approach it from that angle of understanding the people who are in it and their culture, then it's fascinating. But you'll notice that people often aren't encouraged to do so because it's frightening often to the people who are educating them, because it moves them out of their time and place and expands their consciousness.
But if they're history teachers, don't they have a passion for history anyway?
If you're lucky.
Do we have a question online?
We have. I'm curious, and I have a question about the statement Reverend Don made about it being unnatural for people to regress. Isn't regression, repression, denial a viable survival mechanism?
Well, it must be because there's so much of it.
But also, once you get out of that state of needing that to survive, aren't you supposed to grow back? Because what the question is talking about how these things are something based on survival. So you push back all of these things that you're repressing a whole bunch of things in order to survive in a given situation. But once you are removed from that situation, shouldn't you grow back out of that regression and go forward?
And I will say that what I probably should have said is that not that it's unnatural, but that it's undesirable. Certainly these things are natural enough, but they aren't necessarily the best reaction. At least that would be my opinion.
But couldn't it be like pruning a tree?
It would be.
Like if you get off in a certain direction, you need to pare back that, and then.
Well, when people feel that they're in danger, they naturally will pull back.
Yeah.
Whether that's psychologically, culturally, or otherwise. However, that should be a temporary phase.
Yeah.
I think temporary in a sense also that people really need to look at it and understand why they're pulling back to begin with and deal with their fears.
Yeah, it's not necessarily the best reaction.
No.
Though I will grant it is a natural enough reaction, but not necessarily the desirable reaction, especially when we're talking about culturally. When we're talking about a person having that reaction, when we're talking about a movement having that reaction, it can be much more damaging. Because they'll pull everybody else back with them if they can. Which we see again and again throughout history, which of course does mean it is a natural enough thing. What other questions do we have?
Just a comment, the regression may be a way of separating those capable of evolving and those who are incapable.
Well, certainly in the moment, and possibly in some cases on a more permanent basis. But certainly in the moment when someone pulls back that way, it's because they're not capable of moving forward at that moment. That doesn't mean they're never capable of it. And sometimes they'll pull back and then later move forward, which ideally is what happens. But you look at the end of the Roman Empire, and what followed is a huge regression for the most part. It depends on exactly where you're looking at. But you think about the things that they lost out of their fear of embracing them. Because they were really on the verge of moving forward into a world that would have been much more like the world that we are currently in. And in some ways they were very close to it as it was. And they would not have had to move much farther to have had much more significant technological advancement, but they frightened themselves and instead fell apart. And what came for the world then was, I would say, a pretty bad period. Although, people always fight and they always do things, but there was a frenzy of destruction of the very technology that they were afraid of, and then the very social structures they were afraid of. Because their social structures were very much like the modern world.
But at the same time, aren't there periods of history where a little regression instead of moving forward would have been for the benefit? Where something negative happened, that if we had pulled back a second and said, hold on, how's this going to roll out? I mean, I can understand where you're coming from that idea that the regression hindered these people, but...
I would say that isn't necessarily regression.
Okay.
And I would point out that at the end of the Second World War, when we had developed nuclear weapons, the whole world kind of pulled back and said, no, we're not going to use these.
That's correct.
But I wouldn't call that regression. I would call that a sensible action, which for the most part we've been able to maintain. But the regression would have been if they killed the scientists and destroyed the labs. Which is what happened at the end of the Roman Empire.
Okay.
Think of Hypatia.
Okay. Another question. What about the sub-societies that are out there, the varying subcultures? Do those issues apply to all or just the majority?
What kind of subcultures?
Well, there are a couple of different answers to that because I'm not exactly sure on what's being asked.
Native American, Roma, Strega.
So we're talking specifically pagan subcultures?
Well, what I would say to that is it's always best to move forward. Moving forward does not mean losing your identity. Maintaining one's identity is not the same thing as regression. But I do see many of those subcultures retreating in fear into situations that are not necessarily to anyone's benefit, like the constant infighting that we see in the community, which I would call an aspect of fear. And I do not think that helps anyone, including the person who is pulling back in that way. It may make them feel safe in the short run, but by destroying the community, it does not make them safe in the long run. Next question. Now, is this what you had in mind when you invited us to join you this evening?
I'm cool with anything. I'm ready to roll with it.
And what could be done about that?
That's a very hard question. But the only thing that can really be done about it is for the people who can get along to get along. And for the people who can't get along, to be allowed not to get along, but not to be allowed to stop those who do get along from getting along. And the ones who do get along need to stop permitting those who don't get along from pulling them apart, which has been what's been happening in the last 20 years. My experience is most of the organized traditions do get along, but they allow themselves to be pulled apart, often without even realizing the dynamic as it's happening.
Another question. How can pagans as a whole work towards acknowledging who we are in a society that fears us?
Well, I think it's very important, and there are many answers to this, because there are group answers and individual answers. The individual answer, so you have to ultimately ask yourself, whose life is it? And the answer to that will be, well, it's yours. And you need to live in the way that you see as right, and do the best that you can do. And I think that if we all do that, and we do the best we can do, that will go a long way toward making other people not afraid. The other thing is, as a movement, we have to be very public. We have to be as responsible as we can, and show people they don't need to be afraid of us. And the biggest part of making them not afraid of us is to let them see us, because people are much less afraid of what they see than they are of what they don't. And so those who try to hide in secrecy really are making the problem worse.
Right. We're better off educating the public about how we feel, who we are, and certainly how we choose to be individuals as well, to move forward and to improve the world.
And of course we understand not every individual can be highly public. I'm speaking at the level of the movement. And I think that
But there's also different levels of public. I mean, while it might be dangerous for an individual to be out to his or her community, taking that small step and being out to your loved ones, like your family, and having them understand, and then having your family behind you to maybe bring it as a family to a neighborhood. And be just like, so yeah, my son or daughter is, doing this. It's pretty chill. You notice that she does since she started doing Wicca, she's been, going out into the community and doing more community service. I think this has done really great for her. And so when other family members, when other community members are just like, I'm really talking to their, wives at their social club, are just like, I'm really worried about my son Bobby. He's looking at this Wicca stuff. And then the other one will be just like, well, Sharon, I just need to tell you that, my Alexa has been doing this Wicca thing. And you'll notice that when she started doing it, she was much more happy. She got so much more friends. I mean, we don't talk about it that often because people don't like it, but, you should let Bobby do it. And so little by little, it seeps into a community, and it gets more and more acceptance. And then once you have those few kids that are doing it, and then it gets to be okay among their parents.
Right.
And then among the parents, it becomes like the whole soccer group ends up being that. And then they have, bake sales, and they decide to do these different things. And it gets, the more and more community action that you do, started out with a little voice, and then all the little voices combine and get a bigger voice.
As it is, we, certainly as a community, we are doing that to begin with when we donate a lot of food for the homeless, and and also many things for toys for the children who are in the hospital. We do a lot of charitable acts in the community as it is, and it's good for people to see that we're among the rest of you.
I think something else that's important to say is that there are always people who will be bigots. And there are people who will not accept us, and people who will not like us. And we cannot spend all of our time or any of our time really trying to convince them to like us. We need to be who we are.
Exactly.
And the reasonable people will see that they don't need to be afraid.
Right.
The unreasonable people will always be unreasonable, but they really are a minority compared to the reasonable ones.
Right, because human nature never changes.
Yeah. And it's the people who really, really are bothered by it are bothered because it's a mirror to them, because that's always what the problem is.
That's true.
People are rarely really bothered by what somebody else is doing unless they feel some reaction to it in themselves. There are exceptions.
Of course.
And there are certain things that one should always be bothered by. But in most cases, if you're bothered by something that's not touching you personally or harming people, then you must be afraid of something else, including that in some way questions your self-identity. I think part of the problem that we have with certain conservative religious movements is that they have very fragile self-identity because they don't really believe what they're teaching. Therefore, any challenge to it challenges them much more deeply. Because if you're fighting your doubts in the first place, then when other people don't believe it, then it's much harder for you to convince yourself that you believe what you don't really believe. The ones who really do believe it are not the bigots. They're not the problem.
They don't feel threatened.
Exactly.
Through their own fear and self-doubt.
Mm.
So.
And there are wonderful people in every religious movement.
That's right. That's right. We're always going to have that. You're always going to have a good and a not so good.
Yeah. And we have our own who are not so
That's
good.
right.
And so we must take the moment to acknowledge that there are good people and bad people in every religion, including our own.
That's right.
It's that along the lines of the social acceptance normal. The study that was done that when 4% of the population holds an unshakable belief that it will become accepted by the majority.
Well, I don't know if that would necessarily be a universal truth. But within our own culture, I would say that perhaps that percentage might be true. I would say that if you look historically, it's definitely not necessarily true. There are a number of cultures which have had terrible massacres of segments of their population that were much larger than 4%. Particularly the religious wars of Europe. However, within the kind of the more open and more democratic culture that we have, I would say that a group is. I would say that that would probably be largely true. However, I would also say there are other variables that are involved in that, including the coherence of that 4% and whether they can identify with one another or not. Because there are far more people who hold similar spiritual views, and the whole point of talking about Joesph Campbell in the first place, because he certainly was not pagan that I know of, but his point of view is pretty much the same. But would he be counted in our numbers, or would we be counted in their numbers? Do we even, many of our people see that similarity? And that's where when you start talking percentages, I suspect he would have identified himself as spiritual. I could be mistaken.
Well, it says in here that after learning about Hindu and Indian thought, he ceased to be a Catholic.
Yeah.
So he was.
How exactly he identified himself, I don't know. But what I would say is that there are many people who share spiritual points of view, but because they are unable to make common cause, because they're seeing the smaller differences that divide them, reaching that percentage is very difficult. Which is one of the reasons I constantly preach against seeing the differences. Because if we could all stand together, we'd be far more than 4% of the community.
One more question. I've often heard that fear is the antithesis of love. Should we therefore meet fear with understanding and a general love of our fellow man?
Well, I definitely believe that in the end there are really only the two emotions, love and fear. And when possible, I think it is best to meet fear with love. I won't say that's always possible.
It is if you surrender to your higher self, the beauty and the perfection of who we are as a soul. Certainly if people can remember that, and they're here right now in the moment, certainly that is true. You just surrender to the higher self, you surrender to love, you surrender to your heart, you surrender all your fears and all your limitations to the infinite spirit of who we are as souls. And that way we will be an instrument of light and love in the world and benefit the universe.
That's basically essentially how they describe enlightenment in Buddhism, isn't it? Is that you kind of like let go of all that, you become your higher self, and they use the words perfect love.
Well, that may be true. Yes, I suppose you could say that. But certainly it's seemingly one of the universal truths, regardless of whether it borders on Buddhism or not.
Well, that's the whole point of Joesph Campbell.
That's right.
The truths are universal.
Exactly.
And there are Christians who say the exact same thing, and Buddhists and Hindus, because these spiritual truths are basically universal.
That's right.
Well, the Buddhists believe that Jesus would have been a Buddha, right? Because he had that whole aspect of perfect love, like you were talking about. And so like whenever we see any of these people, they actually do speak to that idea of that perfect love.
Well, if we were a lot more relaxed, we'd get more I mean, if you're more relaxed, you're able to think more clearly, I would say. And you go, oh yes. No, I know. So, you're a lot more open, in other words. You're not so bogged down. With the stress of it all.
Yes.
Any other questions? Did you want to speak to anything that Reverend Lewis said earlier?
Yes and no. I mean, I feel certainly the Reverend is very well spoken, and he pretty much has said everything that I perhaps would have wanted to have said in the first place, but in a lot more. So, thank you very much for having me sit in.
Yeah.
And I would say that it is always preferable to meet fear with love. And when we talk about doing the best that we can, living the best life we can as an example, that really is the best way to do that, I think, in most cases. I do think that one cannot... If the semi-truck is about to hit your car, you got to swerve.
That's for sure.
But I think for the most part, safe driving is the best action.
But also, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
But also, if one were to look on seeing their glass half full instead of half empty, in other words, being grateful for what you have and stop concentrating on what your neighbor has or what you don't have, but concentrate on who you are and be grateful for everything. Be grateful for your life, and you'll be a lot happier.
There's a practice called the gratitude list, where you basically list in your mind everything you're grateful for. And it's really a very good practice, because people usually will find the very first time and succeeding times that there's way more that they're actually happy about than they realize when they're not thinking about it.
That's right. Because if we think about things right now, if we're here in the moment, this is the thing, and people are rarely here right now.
Yeah.
They think about the past, and happened an hour ago, they think about the future, which is an illusion actually, and waste the now, waste the moment.
It's often true.
I had a friend who worked at a blind institute, and he had this one story that he would always tell people who were feeling down. And when you're a teenager, you feel down a lot. And he said that there was this blind man who had been born blind. He'd never seen anything his entire life. And he would get up every morning and be thankful for 3 things. He would be thankful, 1, that he woke up.
Well, that's a
He'd be
start.
thankful, 2, that he had a loving wife who woke up beside him every morning. And he'd be thankful, 3, that he had a house to wake up in. And every morning he would wake up thankful for these 3 things. And he would, go about his day being thankful for those things. And then, going about, every morning he would wake up, count the 3 things, and be just like, today's going to be a good day.
Well, I'm like that in the morning. God, I'll just say, oh, I'm so grateful for this bed. It's so thank you. Oh, I have to get up. I'm grateful I'm waking up, though. It's a new day.
So there's always something to be thankful for.
Question with the idea of meeting things with love is in the shamanic journey, you're supposed to go right at your fears. Like if there's something scary in front of you, you're supposed to basically attack it with a stick.
Yes.
How does that fit in?
Well, what would I say to that? When you go straight at your fear, that can be done certainly from a point of view of love.
Okay.
The difference would be anytime you're moving forward, you're not moving backward. And whether you're moving forward with a stick to smack it with, or whether you're moving forward from a point of view of love, you're not pulling back from it in fear, which gives it more power.
Also, you're using a lot more resolve. I resolve to face this.
Yeah.
This fear, and so certainly it combines everything.
And it's also important to say that approaching something from the point of view of love does not mean being a doormat. It does not mean being stupid. It does not mean giving up your essential rights or personhood. It means not demonizing the person you're dealing with.
Exactly.
Basically, finding love in yourself to move forward and face somebody who's doing something negative to you, and saying, you know what?
That does not mean that you let them do it.
Right. That means I love me. I'm going to say stop.
Exactly. Sticking up for yourself in dignity and love. And it shows one needs to love oneself in order to project love to the world, because we are transient beings, and it affects everything and everyone, basically.
And when people look at their fears, they often, they have a fear reaction. But and when we're talking about because it started with that subject started with being in a society where people are generally afraid of us. But if you look at history, there have been many occasions where a small group of people made a big change. Sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse, depending on the people. But many occasions where a comparatively small group has made a huge change, and there's no reason on earth that we can't do the same thing.
Right. They say one candle can light 1,000 hearts.
Yeah, it's absolutely true.
Would that go into the idea of a positive feedback loop? Because I know we've been talking a lot here at the museum about how negative feelings will foster negative feelings and foster negative feelings, so that in the example of standing up to your fears, instead of having a negative reaction of drawing back and feeding into that fear so that it comes at you more, you're standing up with love for yourself and pushing that love forward and saying, I'm not going to let this happen to me. And so then that person can see the positives of themselves in what you're doing, and they can say, well, I was being kind of a dick for doing this. I should probably stop, and I should probably work on myself. And so then they can start having positive.
Happen.
Yeah.
It will.
Very often, if you're dealing with a reasonable person, which is to say someone who is not totally overwhelmed by their own fears, once they see the positive example that you are setting, they will reconsider their opinion and realize they may have been wrong.
It's often true.
It's not universally true, but it's often true.
At which point you say, thank you, and not, told you so.
Exactly.
That's a very important point, too. Being being positive means being positive, not being aggressive,
Right.
usually.
We have another question?
From Glaciers, would you then agree that complaining about what you don't have is useless as opposed to deciding what you want and taking steps to attain it?
Absolutely.
Absolutely, very true.
Your complaining does very little good.
No, just makes you miserable and bitchy.
Mm.
Excuse me.
It's like running away from the demon instead of grabbing the stick and going after it.
And complaining about what you don't have also serves the function of reinforcing the idea that you could not have it. Whereas the truth is, with very few exceptions, whatever you want, you can have. It may be hard, but it can be done. Oberon wanted unicorns.
You got unicorns.
That's an example.
If Oberon can get a unicorn, anything can be done.
Well, true. If you're thinking about you can't have this, and you could just start listing, oh, I can't have it for this reason, this reason, this reason, and if you're thinking, this is what I want, now I can get that by doing this, this, and this, this, and this.
Right, you believe it in your heart and in your soul. The thing is that when you do complain, you're pushing away the very thing or person you want, because you're just putting that energy out there. And don't forget, we're magnets.
Well, one of our primary teachings in the magical community is that like attracts like.
Exactly.
It's amazing how often we forget it.
Until it hits us on the side, the sidewinds us, and we go, oh yes.
Next question. But I definitely feel that, well, again, to use the phrase used earlier, to light one candle is better than to curse the darkness.
That's right.
And to complain about what you don't have does nothing to help you get it, where the simplest step towards it will do more.
Because you put it out there, and certainly when you feel it deeply with the emotion, and just feel deeply that you can have this, and that is so, and that the universe will take care of you, that the universe will say, okay,
Mm-hmm.
it will bring it to us. Eventually, it tips over into the physical. It may take some time, but it happens.
But not only that, but thinking positively will make you think of different ways to achieve your goal.
Exactly.
So it'll start goal setting for you. So you want to achieve this thing, you need to do X, Y, and Z beforehand.
Exactly. You just can't sit there and go, okay, universe.
Well, it's like the old story of the person who prayed to the goddess to win the lotto. And prayed, please goddess, let me win the lotto. Please goddess, let me win the lotto. Every day they prayed, please goddess, let me win the lotto. Finally they said, I've lost my faith. Goddess, I prayed and prayed and prayed to win the lotto, and I never won the lotto. Why did you do this to me? And the goddess said, well, you could have bought a ticket.
That's right. This is the thing.
Simple steps will
That's
sometimes
right.
do a lot of good.
Question.
I love this question.
Oh, good.
Is there such a thing as being too modest or too humble?
Yes, if it undercuts your belief in yourself.
Agreed.
Modesty is a great virtue. But like every other trait, it can be overdone. Also, there's such a thing as false modesty.
That's right.
So yes, I would say that is possible. However, few people in our community are challenged in that way.
It's pretty well said.
So,
Yeah. So, we kind of strayed a little bit from Joesph Campbell. I mean, we kept the spirit within the table.
well, I would say that everything we've discussed has come from the central premise that we began with, which is the importance of seeing the similarities and that the truths of the universe are universal. One of the things that I believe Campbell talks about in his works is that if you look at advanced spiritual thinkers, in every religion, the things they say are pretty close to one another, because those truths are universal. And when you get to the deeper thought of almost every religion, it's pretty much the same. There are some differences, but it's pretty much the same. Because ultimately we want the same things, we have the same relationship to deity. Right. It's the window dressing that changes from one movement to the next.
That's very true.
And when you get past that level of any given religion, you'll find that the rest will echo the same truths in different ways. And I think that that is ultimately the message of Campbell's works, and I think it's a very profound message.
It is. In other words, you could also say the face of God has many names.
Yes.
And this is the thing. And certainly what you were talking about a moment ago about our religions, without even reading a lot of Campbell's work, when I was a young girl and I was exploring world religions, I found that to be very true, that it was the same.
It really is.
It was really the same, that common thread.
The cultures are different.
Yes.
Some of the expression is different.
Right.
But the ultimate ideas are very universal.
Very.
And I think they have been at every stage in humanity. And that what changes is mostly at the cultural rather than the spiritual level. Although certainly our understandings do deepen.
Right, one hopes.
One hopes.
Sorry. Now it's kind of like a summary to all this. Joesph Campbell is usually quoted with his most famous phrase, "Follow your bliss." And so I'd like to finish off this session by asking, do you guys feel that you have been following your own blisses in your lives?
I have to say, certainly, I have in many ways. I have a lot of work to do, admittingly, but yes, I'm very, very happy these days, much happier than I was years and years and years ago when I was younger. And one needs to learn this, unfortunately, sometimes through discomfort, like pain. You know, it's one of those, it's like burning yourself. You go, oh my God, I should burn myself. So you're not going to go near that flame again on that stove. It's the same way. It's through growth. It's through maturing. It's through, I learned through hit and miss in many ways, although I was very, very blessed and fortunate to have a lot of excellent mentors. But yes, I could say following a lot of my bliss, and I'm very happy.
And, you know, it's worth stating, because you were mentioning burning yourself, there are some humans who do not have a pain reaction. It's a rare condition, but you know, you hear from them how easily they injure themselves because they don't feel the heat of the stove until they've burnt themselves and hurt themselves really badly. And that pain, which is part of everyone's life, is to keep us safe from things that hurt us.
That's right.
And, you know, I often say I don't believe ultimately that I believe ultimately everything happens for a good reason, and I think that is a very important illustration of that.
I agree.
So there you go.
Would you say that you are following your bliss?
Yeah, but it's a complicated list.
All right.
It's like a giant ball of bliss twine. Leads in many different directions.
Sure.
Well, as long as you find your way through the labyrinth with it.
Yes.
What?
Nothing.
Did you just say something about his puppies? Your puppy should stop playing with your ball of bliss twine.
I'm being blamed for things that I didn't even say.
Oh. All right. Well, that's our little discussion on Joesph Campbell, and we had some fantastic witches here talking to you about their feelings on the subject matter and lots of things that really were very tangential to Joesph Campbell. Next week, I believe Melissa will be back, and we'll talk about Chapter 1.
Very good.
So, see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's lots of fun.
And just so that you guys know, if you do send cookies, they get some too. I'll share with them, I promise.
Yeah,
Cookie and $1 shout outs.
she's
Yeah.
very
Oh,
generous.
that's right. We do have a donation button. If you guys like this programming and you want to keep us fed and have us get our own cookies, donate to the museum so that we can continue bringing fantastic study groups like this to you, as well as to the local community.
Yes, indeed.
Yay.